I don't know if y'all have ever known people like this before. Maybe you have. Maybe you used to be that kind of person. But have you known people that are just completely unwilling to believe in God, to believe in anything that God is doing? They don't want to believe in the scriptures. They don't want to believe that God moves and acts in this world, no matter what they see, no matter what's going on around them. Do y'all know people like that? That just will not and do not want to believe. And oftentimes when you know people like that, they'll complain and they'll say, if God would just make himself obvious or something, if he would write his name up in the sky or something like that, then surely we would believe. But the reality is, even if he actually did all of that, most of those kinds of people would find a way, some reasonable, some logical excuse to dismiss what has happened, that it's just coincidence, it's just a natural process or something. And they'll completely ignore what God has done, with things like the complexity of the universe, the fine-tuning of all the conditions that make life possible. Even the argument that's out there about the fact that we can even look into the universe at all is a miracle, because most places, most systems, and most parts of this galaxy are so filled with dust they can't see much of anything. And yet we're in an ideal spot to see everything. One thing that we need to understand, even though there are people like that out there, that even if they saw everything, seeing is not always going to lead to believing. Y'all realize that? Seeing is not always going to lead to believing. And this Torah portion makes a statement very similar to that in chapter 29 about the Israelites. Despite everything that they had seen, despite everything that God had done, that they'd seen him do, somehow many of them still did not believe. In chapter 29, he says, Moses called to all Israel and said to them, "You have seen all that Adonai did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and all his servants and all his land. The great trials that your eyes saw, those great signs and wonders." When you think about this passage, what he's saying here, it was those who were over 20 years old that were not counted as the fighting men, who were not allowed to enter into the promised land. It's those who were over 20, that were counted as fighting men who were not allowed to enter into the promised land. That those were the ones that were going to die in the wilderness, in the wanderings. So that means that there were some that were under 20, right? There were those that were under 20 who were, do you think they'd be old enough to remember what life in Egypt was like, being under 20? Any of y'all remember your life when you were 18, 19 years old? A few of you may not want to remember those moments, but But some of those people under 20 were old enough to remember what life in Egypt was like, who were old enough to understand what God was doing in how he redeemed them. They could testify to the younger ones that were maybe not old enough to remember everything. They were able to testify and tell the kids of their own, because they would have had kids of their own by this point at the end of their wanderings. So there were still eyewitnesses of all that God had done. But did these miracles, did these trials, did these signs and wonders really help them believe in God? Did it really help them to know him, to trust him, to help them obey him? See, this is what God thinks about their faith. He's calling to them, you've seen everything, these great trials that you saw, these great signs and wonders. But to this day, Adonai has not given you a heart to know, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. Despite all that he had been doing, it still had not grown and manifested in them. It's not that he wasn't trying to give the people these things. It's not that he didn't want them to know him, to see him, or to hear his voice. So that in spite of everything that he had done on their behalf, they still, many of them, had not come to really, in their heart, to believe. He didn't create the kind of heart that wants to know him and get close to him. He had not created the kind of faith that truly understands him and his ways. He had not healed this blindness that was there to who he is or what he is doing. He had not opened the ears of this people to Shema, to hear and obey his commands. Now, I wouldn't be too hard on him if I were you. Think about it. If God were going to be doing these kinds of things in our day, what percentage of our population would still not believe, do you think? 10%? How many think it's higher than 10%? Higher than 20%? Higher than 30%? 50%? 70%? It would be up there, right? It would be higher than we would want it to be. We like to think of ourselves as reasonable people, as people who believes in evidence and science and all that other kind of stuff, right? We want to believe what we see with our eyes, but even if God were to do all these kind of things in our day, a great number of our countrymen wouldn't believe at all. They'd find a way to discount it. I would like to think that the majority of our people's hearts would be soft enough to respond. I would like to believe that most of our fellow citizens have not been given over in the futility of their thinking. But I wonder, what would it take to get our attention? What would it take to get us to believe and to seek after him with our heart, soul, mind, and strength? And how would we change? Think about this. How would we change as a people, as a nation, if we truly did respond to him? If we did have a heart to know and eyes to see and ears to hear? If faith in Messiah, Yeshua, spread through us like the great awakenings that you hear about in generations past, what would happen? Or what should happen if that were to take place? What should happen in the life of any one person or any people that change and believe? In a lot of ways, that's, if we believed, then we would begin to change, wouldn't we? We'd begin to assimilate into the kind of life that did know him, desire to know him, that did seek his face, that did see his hand, that did hear his voice. When you think about the language that is used to describe these changes, as someone comes to Messiah, we've already talked about it a little bit, because everything starts with what? In the midst of the darkness, what do we need to start with? It starts with repentance, right? It starts with teshuvah. If you remember growing up with Vacation Bible School, and you've done it year after year after year, the A stands for the ABCs of faith. Y'all remember those things after, dozens and dozens and repetitions? A stands for what? Admit. See, we got some up here. Admit that you are a sinner, right? Isn't that what it starts with? Admit that you're going the wrong way, that you need to turn and start to go the right way, turn away from your sin, turn towards God, right? Proverbs 14 is one of those passages that we always use. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. That teshuvah, repentance, that's where it's got to start. I was wrong. I have sinned. I was going the wrong way. Now I want to go the right way. And it's not enough to know that you're going the wrong way. Because another way, you could start going in a different direction. Another direction can be just as wrong as the way that you're already going. It's not just that you know that you're going the wrong way. You must be shown or taught the right way. That's what his word does for us. Right? It's like moving to a new home, a new town, a new country, where all of a sudden you have to learn a new neighborhood, you have new neighbors, you have to know all the different routes that you have to take, a new culture and a new way of life. You cannot be doing things exactly as you had done them before. And if you're not willing to admit that you're going the wrong way, you have no chance really of ever going the right way. Teshuvah requires a new way, a new path, a new way of life, which is really more about going back to the old way, the ancient paths. We admit, then there's the B and C, right? The B stands for believe, and the C stands for confess, right? These two, believing and confessing, believing that he was raised from the dead, confessing that he is your Lord, Savior and Lord. That's how it's always been talked about, what most of us probably grew up hearing, right? It reminded me of what it must have been like with experiences that we don't typically have, what it must have been like appearing before the king. When like Uriah the Hittite must have done at some point in pledging loyalty to the king. And I have a couple of short little clips from a moment like that. You might recognize this one if it's where it's the kneeling before the king, or this is actually the steward. I should get that correct.
I offer you my service, such as it is, in payment of this debt.
So that's the first one. Then there's later.
I swear fealty and service to God, Lord.
He's once again kneeling.
In living or dying, from this hour henceforth, until my Lord release me, of death take me.
And I shall not forget it, nor fail to reward that which is given.
So the whole premise of those scenes, that when he first steps forward and offers his services, he has no clue what he just did. And the guy standing in the background is like, oh man, you've just gotten yourself in a whole load of trouble. And then he has to realize, he comes back to it later and realizes that I have to make this oath and this vow to follow through with what I said I would do earlier. It's like being knighted before the king. In modern times, the equivalent would be when someone takes the oath to become a citizen of the United States. I looked that up this week, and wow. Look at this text of what is a citizenship oath of the United States. It says, I hereby declare on oath, and we don't take oaths seriously anymore, do we? That I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen, that I will support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I will bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by the law, that I will perform non-combatant service in the armed forces of the United States when required by the law, that I will perform work of national importance under civilian direction when required by the law, and that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose or of evasion, so help me God. Now you'd better know what you're getting yourself into if you're going to say all of that, right? With all the divisions in the country today, I wonder how many natural-born citizens would be able to say all that, right? But notice there's this renouncing of previous loyalties, of citizenships or ways of life. Certain things must now be accepted and believed, about your new citizenship, your new nation, your new leadership. And from the mouth comes the oath to take on that new loyalty, that new nation, that new Lord, that new King. And it reminds me a lot of this passage from Romans. If you confess with your mouth that Yeshua is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart it is believed for righteousness, and with the mouth it is confessed for salvation. For the scripture says, whoever trusts in him will not be put to shame. All this kind of language that we've maybe heard or grown up with, we don't really understand the significance of it. See, this language is a lot more like that language from the constitutional oath than it is just something to say up in front of a bunch of people without much thought given to it. See, when a person becomes a believer, we willingly bow the knee. That's what, that word blessed, right? And you might see some of us sometimes when you say, blessed are you, O Lord our God, there's a little bit of a bowing, a bending of the knee. Blessed means to bend the knee. To willingly bow the knee, to humble ourselves before the King, to affirm him as our King and Lord. When that is done, something is supposed to change. They're no longer a foreigner or a stranger, but they are considered a fellow citizen. This is all language that we've heard. There's no longer a wild olive branch, but one that has been brought in and grafted in to that cultivated garden, that special tree. No longer lost with no place in the covenants of promise, but now included, added, a participant. We become a part of a holy nation, and more, a member even of God's household. Through that process that we hear about, we've been adopted, right? Adoption first belongs to Israel, but it was extended to those who pledged their loyalty to the King. Romans 9 talks about it like this, for I would pray that I myself were cursed and banished from Messiah for the sake of my people, my own flesh and blood. This is how seriously he would take this situation. My own flesh and blood who are Israelites. For to them belong the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the Torah and the temple service and the promises. Right? That means something. That word adoption, now I'm probably saying it wrong, huithesia. The first word is compound. It says huios, means a son. And the tethemi means to set, place, appoint, establish, or ordain. Right? It's you are designating someone as a part of the family. Adoption is bringing in, often an unrelated person into the family and establishing a legal and a permanent relationship, giving them rights and privileges and even an inheritance as if they were one of your own biological children. Ephesians puts it like this. It says, he chose us in the Messiah before the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless before him in love. He predestined us for adoption as sons through Messiah Yeshua, in keeping with the good pleasure of his will. So he was intending on adopting a great number of people into his family. Those who are adopted and made part of the family of God are expected to live by the same standard as the natural children, to be holy and blameless. That was given to Israel, right? And these adopted kids are supposed to be holy and blameless as well. Set apart. That blameless is an interesting word. It's amomos, which the first letter A or alpha is a negative particle, meaning no or without. Then momos, which means blemish, without blemish. Like a sacrifice without spot or blemish, morally without blemish, faultless, without a basis of accusation. And what defines what is something that is a blemish or not? How do we know whether something is blemished or not? What tells us what God's standard is? His word, his Torah, right? Now, in the ancient Roman world, This is what's so odd. The parents of any child that's born to them, they had the option of disowning their biological children for just about any reason at any age. So it was actually a bit unsafe to be a biological child of a family. But an adopted child was chosen, was desired, and they would permanently be a part of the family. They could not disown the adopted child at all. And from various things that I've read, they have the ceremony of how they symbolize this, depicted this. If the child, again, usually it was the boys, if they were very young, the ceremony would be that involved, the woman would wear like a large dress or skirt, and they would hide the child under her dress, and they would bring the child out from under the dress as if giving birth to the child. If they were older, it often would involve clothing the adopted one in the clothes or the mantle of the father, like bringing them under their wings of the talit. Or even like Elijah, where he passes on his mantle to Elisha in 1 Kings 19, right? It's that there's an evidence of clothing that is being transferred over to the next one. Galatians 4 talks about this. Chapter 4, verse 5 talks about us receiving the adoption as sons. But if you back up just a little bit to chapter 3, look at what we read. Whoop. I was supposed to put those up there. But this is Galatians chapter 3. It says, "For you are all sons of God through faith, through trusting in Messiah Yeshua. For all of you who were immersed in Messiah have done what? You've clothed yourself with Messiah." To the point that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. If you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Do you see how this language carries through? That when there are the natural born children, the Jewish kids, but then those that are adopted in, but they are treated as how many families here? It's one family. There's one family with one father, one king to whom we have pledged our loyalty. And so it's not just a stranger or a foreigner, one that's tolerated and allowed to hang around. God's grace goes further, and he is willing to make us even a citizen of the commonwealth. And even though that would be enough, that would have been sufficient, right? If you remember back to Passover days, that would have been sufficient just to allow us to be citizens. The Father goes even further and adopts us into his household. Our teshuvah, our pledge of loyalty to Messiah, brings us under his wings. He clothes us with Messiah and adopts us into the family. So no one, when you think about it, nobody from the traditional church background that we grew up with would really have a problem with any of that, would they? That idea of being adopted, that idea of being brought in. Most of that language, that terminology, that phrasing is loved and accepted. But again, we don't really recognize or realize the significance of what is just been transpired, what is transacted here. Because when God does these things, when we pledge ourselves to the king, God obligates himself to do these things, to just as a nation accepts the foreigner's citizenship. In the mind of traditional theology, this process requires very little from us. Because we stand on that idea of it's by grace through faith and not by, what is it? It's not by works. Is that true? Can we ever do and excel enough at keeping of the Torah that we would earn our place? No, we would never do that. But we also don't take those confessions, those oaths of loyalty seriously anymore. and our traditional backgrounds, we don't want to consider what a pledge of loyalty to the king really means and what we have made when we have professed our faith in him, in Messiah Yeshua. We don't want to consider what we have obligated ourselves to. Now look again at that citizenship oath. All right? I renounce all and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen. And again, this is a very strong statement. Even willing to fight on behalf when required. Not when you feel like it, not when you want to, but it says required. How much of that oath, of this oath here, deals with the obligation of the United States that receives them? Next to nothing. The United States, it's not going on to say, and now that you have pledged your loyalty to the United States, we're going to provide you everything you ever needed and ever wanted. Doesn't say that at all. The oath does not obligate the United States. Most of it is what the new citizen is obligating themselves to as they affirm their new loyalty, forsaking all other loyalties and obligations, placing themselves under the covenant between the people and the government. We call that what? The Constitution. And all the laws established within that framework, that you will even fight for this new loyalty against all enemies. And they were committing to assimilate to this new culture. And this Torah portion, and even the next, continues to discuss that reality. The first part of the chapter 26, where it talks about bringing in the first fruits, when we get into the land, it's as an offering, it's a pledge toward God for all that he has done in getting us to that point, getting the people to that moment. But then in chapter 26, verse 17, the first part of that, as they are coming with all of this, it says, today you have affirmed Adonai as your God. You're making this statement, you're making this confession that this is a demonstration that Adonai is our God. And the next portion describes who is involved or allowed to participate in this affirmation. So I'm getting a little bit into next week's portion. But in chapter 29, it says, you are standing today, all of you, before Adonai your God, the heads of your tribes, your elders, your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your wives, and the outsider within your camp, from your wood chopper to your water carrier. It says, each of you is to cross over into the covenant of Adonai your God that he is cutting with you today, and into his oath. This is in order to confirm you today as his people. So when you look at that, who all was there? Most of this is Israel, right? But he even says that the ones that can do this, the ones that are eligible for this, is the outsider within your camp, from your wood chopper to your water carrier. Some of those people would be those that have been defeated or captured in battle, who are now servants or slaves. But you know what's really funny about this? Is this would include those who even have deceived the people. Like the Gibeonites in Joshua chapter 9. Those people would be included or allowed. Because you remember that story with the Gibeonites in Joshua chapter 9? They pretended to have traveled this great distance to make a treaty with Joshua. They brought those wineskins that were all old and rotten. They wore their old shoes that had holes in them and everything like that. So it looked like they had traveled really far. Even when they made a covenant with Israel, and even when they figured it out, when they discovered the deception, they were still obligated by their oath and their covenant. But he says, this is what we will do to them. We will let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath which we swore to them. Yes, let them live, the leader said further, but let them do what? Chop wood, and draw water for the entire community. So the leaders decreed concerning them. People like that were allowed. They were eligible to affirm Adonai as their God. These people wouldn't have experienced Egypt at all. But they had to believe. They had to accept. They had to repent from their former way and assimilate into that. Many of the Israelites lost much of their culture while they were slaves in Egypt, along with that mixed multitude that came out with them. It's taken them 38 years of wandering to reassimilate to the ways of God. But look at the context of that, of chapter 26 again. First, in what those who affirm Adonai as their God are affirming to do. He says, today you have affirmed Adonai as your God. And this is what they are agreeing to in doing that. That you will walk in his ways, keep his statutes, mitzvot, and ordinances, and listen to his voice. When you think of, if you were young as a child or whatever else, and you went forward to receive Messiah, as many of us may have grown up doing, did you agree to any of that part, or did you just kind of do the top part? It was just the top part for most of us. This is what it really means. This is the kind of pledge of loyalty that God expects for those who affirm him as their God and as their king. He expects them to walk in his ways. He expects them to keep his statutes, his mitzvot and ordinances, and to listen to his voice. For the Jewish people that do this, there's so much of church history that has tried to get them to step away from all that stuff in coming to Christ, in coming to Messiah, that they are supposed to leave all that kind of stuff behind. And it's exactly the opposite. They are supposed to be reaffirming their commitment to God and his ways. They're not supposed to leave any of that stuff behind. It's the Gentile, when the Gentile commits and affirms Adonai as your God. When the Gentile commits, they're also committing to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his mitzvot, and his Torah. We're the ones that are supposed to change the most. We're the ones that are supposed to assimilate. This is what he expects. It's no different than it is different than just the simple idea of admit, believing, and confessing that Messiah Yeshua, that Yeshua is the Messiah, that he's Savior and Lord. There's more to it than that. In a world that we've grown up with in the past several centuries of revivalism, of emotionalism, of easy believism, we don't realize what we are pledging ourselves to when we say that we believe that he is our God. And we don't want to include this part in the transaction because for most people, they like what they call the fire insurance, right? Y'all heard about that? They want the get out of jail free card, but they don't want anything more than that. They want to say they believe, but they don't really want to have to change their lives all that much, most of them. They still want to be able to continue doing what they were already doing and living as they were already living. They want all the benefits. They want all the handouts. They want all the inheritance of the kingdom. They want the status of being in the family without requiring anything from them. That has to grow, that has to change, that has to assimilate. And that's what we're missing. We're missing this commitment to him and his ways. Because the other side of the transaction, when you look at the king who receives you into his service, into the nation that grants you citizenship, has some expectations. Otherwise, you don't really mean what you say. All right, look back in verse 16. It starts with his command. It's 26:16. It says, "This day Adonai your God is commanding you to do these statutes and ordinances, so you are to take care and do them with all your heart and with all your soul." He starts letting you know exactly what you're agreeing to do. And if you're willing to move on to this next step, guess what you've agreed to? Today you have affirmed Adonai as your God, that you will walk in his ways, keep his statutes, mitzvot, and ordinances. And listen, there's nothing deceptive about this. He's not trying to mislead you about what you're agreeing to. The king lays out his commands, his expectations, and you agree to them, you affirm them, and in response, he affirms you. He receives you into his service as a citizen, as a soldier, or even adopts you as a son or a daughter, and he will then demonstrate his faithfulness, and he will keep his promises. So as you have affirmed him, he affirms you. Verse 18, "Now today Adonai has affirmed you as his treasured people, as he promised you, that you are to keep all his mitzvot, that he will set you high above all the nations he has made for praise, fame, and honor, and that you are to be a holy people to Adonai your God, as he has promised." He sets you up. He lifts you up. As you humble yourself before the Lord, he will lift you up in due time. That's what this is. When you look at we've mentioned it before, the Targums, those Aramaic translations, that commentary that they would often include, that was one of those things that was circulating in the generation before Yeshua, before he was born. It's very interesting to look at those Aramaic translations of things, because it highlights even the greatest commandment that Yeshua speaks in Mark chapter 12. But it also establishes the identity of the one that they are affirming. So the Targum of this passage, he says, "This day doth the Lord our God command you to perform these statutes and ordinances, which you shall observe and do with all your heart and with all your soul. The Lord you have confessed with one confession in the world this day, for so it is written, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, that he may be thy God, and that thou mayest walk in the ways that are right before him, and keep his statutes, commandments, and judgments, and be obedient unto his word." Mark chapter 12 keeps that. What is the greatest commandment? He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Admit, believe, and confess. The statement of faith for biblical Judaism is right here. Be obedient to his word, the Shema. Be obedient to his word. That's what is included when you say that. And the word, especially when you're looking at the Targums, the word in Aramaic is memra. And it became synonymous with God's dwelling presence, his Shekhinah. It became synonymous even with the Messiah, the one whose face Moses could see and meet with. And this understanding of the word, or memra, is what John is drawing from in John chapter 1. It's not a whole bunch of Greek philosophy that this is about. This is about how they understood what the Word was. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. We looked upon his glory, the glory of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth. All of this is straight out of the understanding of memra, of there within the Aramaic Targums that you see in those passages. This is not a foreign philosophy. This is Jewish thought. When you look at the Targum that's called the Jerusalem Targum, it continues this discussion of this passage, and it identifies the Word as the King to whom the loyalty is pledged. Remember, this is all, the Aramaic was developed a century or so before Yeshua was born. It was then written down after. In the Jerusalem Targum it says, "You have chosen the word of the Lord to be king over you this day, that he may be your God. But the word of the Lord becometh the king over you for his name's sake, as over a people beloved as a treasure, as he hath spoken to you, that you may obey all his commands," his commandments. When you pledge your life, when you believe, you admit, believe, and confess, you are agreeing, you're taking an oath of loyalty to the Messiah, to the Word, to the King. And when you do that, you're asking to be placed under his rule and his reign. You are asking to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, mitzvot, and ordinances, to Shema, to his voice alone. That's how he understands the transaction. That's what he expects of your citizenship in his kingdom, your participation in the covenants of promise, and your inclusion in the family. That's how he understands that. And so we bend the knee. We humble ourselves before him. He receives our service, and he promises to lift us up. He sets us high above all the nations he has made for praise, fame, and honor, and that you are to be a holy people to Adonai your God, as he has promised. His standards for his people has not changed at any time. We are to be a holy people. Holiness is defined by what we think or by his word, by his Torah, by his instructions. And so we must believe and change. We must assimilate our ways to the ways of the King. Because as Isaiah chapter 2 talks about it and puts it, when the days of the King arrive, when he rules from Jerusalem, what is it that's going forth out of Zion to rule all the nations? It's the Torah. The Torah will go forth to all the nations. The question is, which nation are you a citizen of? Which are you a part of? And have you been received into the King's service? Are you taking this oath seriously? With all the things that you've seen in this world, all the crazy things going on, all the storms and hail and the things, the fires and things that are going on, all the signs and wonders, or even all the things that God has done in your own life, what kind of heart has he created in you? Do you have a heart to know him? Do you have eyes to see his hand at work? Do you have ears to hear his voice? Because that's what he is trying to create in his people. In all the things that he is doing, he wants to draw us close to him, not just as a subject, not just even as a citizen, but even as an adopted child. That's what he desires to grow and to create in us. And of all the things that he's been doing year after year after year in our lives, do we have a heart to know him? Do we have a heart to follow him and his ways and even go into battle with him? That's what we need to answer. That's what our world needs more and more to hear.